a.m. on August 27th, 2000, a fisherman named Sam Watts did his best to keep his balance on the wet deck of the huge commercial fishing boat that he was working on. And as he tried to do that, he looked over at his crewmate, Michael Edwards, another fisherman, who was grabbing onto the mast as the ship rocked underneath their feet. Sam and Michael and the 4 other crew members on board this boat had just dropped their anchor 56 miles off the northeast coast of Queensland, Australia, and up until about an hour earlier, the sea had been very calm. But now, this huge storm had rolled in, the wind had picked up, the waves were huge, and while the 4 other crew members had already gone below to try to catch some sleep, Sam and Michael were now on the deck, doing their best to try to secure everything before they went down below. And so as the wind is whipping and the waves are smashing against the side of this boat, Sam and Michael decide they should split up to work more efficiently, where Sam will go to the front of the boat and Michael will go to the back of the boat, and they would each kind of work towards the middle of the boat, checking all the fastenings and the knots to make sure everything was good. And then when they reached the center, they would be good and they could go down below. And so they did that. Sam went to the front, Michael to the back, and as they began to work, they kept constant eye contact with each other because this was obviously a very dangerous thing they were doing. But at some point, as Sam was making his way, he had to duck down to check a particular fastening. And so when he ducked down, he lost sight of Michael just for a second. But in that split second, this huge rogue wave smashed the side of the boat, practically capsizing it, sending Sam flying towards the railing. But Sam luckily grabbed onto the railing before being thrown into the water. And then as the boat kind of began to rock back to level, Sam instinctively looked back down the ship to look for Michael. And he watched through the darkness and the rain as Michael went careening off the side into the ocean. He hadn't been able to grab onto anything. And so the instant the boat kind of leveled out again, Sam screamed for Michael, but he couldn't see him. And so he ran down below, woke up the whole crew. And so moments later, the crew was on the deck. They had their big spotlights out, scanning the water, through this big storm, looking for signs of Michael. And at the same time, the captain had come up and he was on the radio talking to police. And so several minutes later, a police boat managed to come out to the fishing boat. And at the same time, the crew is still desperately looking for Michael. They haven't found him yet. And now the police began circling around the whole area, calling out for Michael, throwing out buoys into the water in hopes of, maybe Michael sees one and grabs hold. But nobody could find Michael. He was just gone. And so all that morning into the early afternoon, the police continued to look in the area for Michael. The crew on board the fishing boat did the same thing, but still nobody could find a trace of Michael. And so around noon that day, the search was called off. And the police told Sam and the rest of the crew of this fishing boat that unfortunately, at this point, it seemed very likely that Michael had drowned. And so, of course, Sam and the rest of the crew were basically in shock. I mean, this happened so quickly. How could it be that, Michael just a few hours ago was joking around with them, part of the crew, and now he's dead? I mean, it was just unbelievable. But now, unfortunately, Sam and the rest of the crew had to basically put their grief aside and make a very practical, albeit very cold, decision, which was, even though Michael's dead, do we stay out here and continue fishing? Or because of his death, do we just go back home? And you might think that decision was actually super easy to make, that of course, they would pack it in and go back home. How could you possibly stay out here and go fishing considering what had happened? But you need to understand it cost a lot of money to go out on these fishing excursions, and they had just left, and so they had not caught anything. So they had spent all this money and they had no return from it. And these fishermen were not wealthy. In fact, honestly, they needed the money from this trip just to provide for their families. And so if they did turn around right now, it would really hurt all of them. And it would also make it really hard to get the funding again to go out later. And so after some pretty awkward deliberation, the crew decided that, we got to stay out here and fish. But the silver lining was, hey, if we stay out here for another day or so, maybe Michael's body will float to the surface and we can at least recover him and bring him back home to his family. And so all day that day, the fishermen stayed out and fished, and they were very successful. One after another, they were catching these cod that were 6 feet long and nearly 100 pounds. They're called flowery cods. But despite how incredible this was for their business, this was not a cause for celebration because they had just lost their friend the day before. And so it was a very somber day, and all day, all the fishermen really are looking out at the water, hoping to see Michael's body. But, by the end of that 24 hours of fishing, they didn't see any sign of Michael. And so they packed everything in and they headed back to port. They sold off all of their cod that they had bought. And then each of the fishermen went back to their families and grieved the loss of their friend. A few days later, a factory worker was standing in front of a fish processing line with this huge 97-pound cod right in front of them. This is one of the flowery cods that Sam and the other fishermen had caught 24 hours after their friend had gone overboard. And so this worker took their knife and, like they did every day all day long, began opening up this fish. And at some point, after cutting it open and looking inside of this enormous cod, the worker just stopped and couldn't believe what they were seeing, and then they began to scream. It would turn out a few days earlier, after Michael had been thrown overboard during that storm, he very likely had been alive when he hit the water. But the area where they were fishing off the coast of Queensland, Australia, was known for having lots of sharks and saltwater crocodiles in the area. And so pretty much immediately, Michael was attacked by either a shark or a crocodile, or maybe both. And during this feeding frenzy, as Michael's getting ripped to pieces, his head got ripped off and began to float away. And at some point, one of those huge flowery cods saw the head and ate it whole. And then later that day, Michael's colleagues caught the cod who caught Michael's head. And so that factory worker who opened up that particular cod saw Michael's undigested head looking up at her, and apparently his face was fixed in terror with his eyes wide and his mouth open, as if his final moment had been him screaming. In the early morning hours before sunrise on April 12, 1990, a 31-year-old man named Nathan Neesmith pushed down on the gas throttle of the fishing boat that he was steering just off the coast of Georgia. And as he did this, he expected the boat to naturally kind of kick into a higher gear and go faster. But as he pushed that throttle down, nothing really happened, and the boat just kind of sputtered along, going about half the speed that he expected it to go. Confused, Nathan stepped away and began making his way out towards the deck, where his younger brother, Billy Joe, who was actually the captain of this fishing boat, was out there taking a nap. And Nathan figured, if there was any issue with the boat, Billy Joe was the guy to talk to. He would know how to fix it. Now, for context, the two brothers were on the first day of a 7-day fishing trip that actually Nathan was not supposed to be a part of. The crew was originally going to be Billy Joe, the captain, and the one who actually rented the boat, along with Billy Joe's nephew, and also 2 other commercial fishermen. But at the last second, those 2 other commercial fishermen had bowed out, and Nathan and a friend had volunteered to go to round out the crew. Now, Nathan and Billy Joe, they came from a fishing family, but it was really only Billy Joe who had pursued the family business. Now, Nathan was perfectly handy out on the water and did know how to fish and knew his way around a fishing boat, but compared to Billy Joe, there was a massive gap in experience. Billy Joe was the fisherman, and Nathan really was not. But Nathan and Billy Joe were very close, and so as soon as Nathan heard Billy Joe was in trouble and needed some more fishermen, Nathan didn't hesitate to say he would do it. Because really, for their entire lives, that was sort of their dynamic. Even though Nathan was the older brother, it was Nathan who looked up to Billy Joe, and any chance he got, he would do anything to help Billy Joe. And Billy Joe really respected that and loved that about Nathan. But now, as Nathan made his way out to the deck to wake his brother up to tell him on the first day of the trip, right as Nathan's taking the wheel, that something's wrong with the boat and I can't fix it. And also, Nathan was enormous, like 250 pounds, well over 6 feet tall. He was huge, this big physical presence, but he really was not mechanically savvy at all. And so again, Nathan is sort of feeling like, sorry, and also maybe even second guessing whether or not it was even a good idea for him to have come along. If he can't even fix a minor issue with the throttle or the engine, what's he doing here? But when Nathan woke up his younger brother and explained the issue, Billy Joe was not upset. He was like, okay, we'll go down below and we'll take a look at the engine and make sure everything is okay. However, when they went down and Billy Joe opened up this hatch to look at the engine, smoke immediately came out, and it was very clear to Billy Joe anyways, that this was not like a minor issue. Something seriously was wrong with the engine. This was a big problem. And so Billy Joe began cussing, he's totally frustrated, and he just told Nathan to, go down below and tell the other 2 to wake up and come help. And so huge Nathan turned around and went down into the bunk room down below, and the second he got down to that level of the fishing boat, he just stopped, because there was at least a foot of water in the hallway and in the bunk room when he went inside. And so Nathan screamed at the other 2 fishermen to get up, and so they got up and they're looking down, they're seeing all this water, and so they're starting to panic. And Nathan, he goes back upstairs and he yells to Billy Joe, who's dealing with this engine issue, that in addition to that, it appears the boat is also sinking. And so Billy Joe is like, get buckets, go down there and start bailing out the water. I'm going to call Mayday. And so Billy Joe runs back up to the steering wheel. He grabs the radio, and Nathan and the others can hear him yelling over and over again, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And as that was happening, Nathan and the other two fishermen put on their life vests, grabbed buckets, and went down below to begin manually bailing out the water. But the second they got down there, it was very obvious the water, wherever it was leaking into this ship, was coming in way faster than they could potentially bail out. But they kept doing it, getting the water out as fast as they could, trying to stay calm. They can hear Billy getting more and more frantic, yelling Mayday over and over again. And then all the lights inside of the ship began to flicker, and then they went out, and they were cast into total darkness. The engine basically had stopped, and it was just silence, just the sound of water rushing into this boat. Also, Billy Joe had stopped yelling Mayday because clearly the boat had lost power and the radio didn't work. And unfortunately, before the power cut out, nobody had heard any of Billy Joe's Mayday calls. So nobody knew where they were, nobody knew they were sinking, and without power, they had no way to communicate to anybody. They were totally alone. So Nathan, Billy Joe, and the others did the only thing they could do. They went up to the main deck, they grabbed their inflatable life raft, they blew it up, chucked it over the side, they grabbed as many supplies as they could, put it in the raft, they all made sure they had all their flotation on, and then they jumped into the life raft, abandoning the sinking fishing boat. Now, once all four men were safely inside of this life raft, they were not as panicked as you might think they would be, because they had put enough food and water in this raft to last them at least several days. They all again had their life vests on, so proper flotation, and even though nobody responded to those Mayday calls, it wasn't impossible to think that maybe somebody had heard the Mayday calls and they just had not called back. Maybe there was a rescue operation coming to their location right now. They didn't know, but it felt plausible that they could be rescued. They would just need to kind of ration out their supplies and stay optimistic. However, their optimism quickly faded when, after only being in this life raft for 30 minutes, right as the sun was starting to come up, Nathan began to hear a strange sound. It was coming from somewhere in the life raft. He couldn't quite place the sound, and so at first he kind of tried to ignore it, but then he noticed the life raft was becoming softer, and then he realized the sound he heard was a small hiss. The raft had a leak. And even though the four men were able to trace the sound of this leak to the actual puncture, they didn't have a patch kit or any meaningful way to patch up this hole. And so all they could do was just put their hands over this leak and do their best to seal it. But it didn't stop the air from coming out. It just delayed it. And so over the next hour, again, as the sun is just coming up on the second day of their big fishing trip, the raft finally completely deflated, and all four men were suddenly bobbing in the freezing cold ocean, surrounded by the wreckage of their sinking fishing boat. And so eventually, the men grabbed the biggest piece of wood from the wreckage that came floating by, and it was buoyant enough that it kind of served as like a makeshift raft, but it wasn't buoyant enough to hold all four of them at once, which meant, they had to take turns resting on this raft, and then they'd have to get back in the ocean and kind of wait their turn again. Totally miserable. And as this was happening, they just stared at the hull of their sinking fishing boat that was still poking up out of the ocean, just drift farther and farther away from them because the current was pretty strong. And as they watched their ship just kind of disappear into the distance, and they're just kind of drifting out into the middle of the ocean, they were all just stunned into silence. They could not believe how this had happened, and so quickly. And also, what were they going to do? They're in the worst possible situation here. It just didn't seem possible that they could actually survive this. Now, for reference, even though the men had salvaged a lot of their food and water from the sinking life raft, and they had their flotation devices on, that didn't protect them from hypothermia. It wouldn't matter if it was super warm outside. What mattered is the ocean was really cold. And because they couldn't stay on that raft, they had to keep cycling through, going back in the ocean over and over again. It was just a matter of time before they would get hypothermia. And sometimes hypothermia can kick in just a couple of hours. We're not talking days here. This is going to be quick. And all these guys knew that. And so as these men were forced to have these really morbid discussions around who's going to stay in the water and who's going to stay on the raft, Nathan made a drastic decision. Nathan, being by far the biggest physically out of the four men, he knew that if he wasn't there right now, the other three could easily fit on their makeshift raft and stay out of the water, delaying hypothermia, thereby increasing the odds that they got rescued. And so Nathan did what he always did, and he turned to his younger brother, who he looked up to so much, who he just wanted to help all the time, and Nathan told him, I'm going to swim to the wreckage. I'm going to swim back to the hull of our sinking ship, and I'm going to fashion my own makeshift raft. That way you guys can have this one, and I'll have my own, and we can all get out of here in one piece. Now, keep in mind, it was fairly obvious that the hull of the sinking ship, which was barely visible near the horizon, was at least 3 miles away, just from their own rough calculations. So this is a monster swim to get to that. And so immediately, Billy Joe and the other three were like, no, that is a suicide mission. You cannot do that. Do not swim to the hull. You're not going to make it. Now, just to give some additional context here, if you're not familiar with just how challenging swimming in the open ocean is, I'm going to give you my limited experience. So when I was in the military, we had to do one 5.5 mile open ocean swim. And then also we did a whole bunch of 2 mile ocean swims. And even though we were allowed to use amazing wetsuits and fins, we had a swim partner with us. We had the land nearby to use as a reference to make sure we're going the right direction. We had food, we had water, we were in great shape. Even with all of that, open ocean swims are miserable. You get all this salt in your mouth and your nose, you start cramping and chafing. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours to swim some of these distances, and you're constantly fighting against the waves. I mean, it is an absolute chore swimming in the open ocean, again, even with all the right stuff in place. And you got to remember, Nathan is this big guy, he's got this big bulky life vest on that's going to make it hard to swim. He doesn't have fins, he doesn't have a wetsuit, and he's got no landmarks around him, to make sure he's going in a straight line. Typically, when you're swimming in the ocean, you're constantly looking at the land or some other landmark to make sure you're going in the right direction. He wouldn't have had that. And also, it's this unknown distance he's covering, and there could be predators in the water. I mean, there's so many barriers here that basically there was like a 0% chance this swim would be successful. But Nathan totally understood what he was really doing here. He didn't really know if he was actually going to make it to that boat. Frankly, that was not really the point. What he was really doing was choosing to sacrifice himself to potentially save his brother and the other two. And so even though they were telling him, do not go, do not swim in that direction, you're not going to make it, Nathan just turned to his brother Billy Joe and said, I love you. And then he turned and began swimming. And by some miracle, 11 hours later, right as the sun was setting, Nathan was still alive and still swimming, and he did reach the sinking boat that still had its hull poking out of the water. Now, when Nathan got to the sinking ship, he was almost dead from dehydration, from hypothermia. I mean, he's miserable, but he's made it to his destination completely against all odds, and he climbed up onto this hull, and he found a spot on the hull of the ship that supported his weight, and he managed to tie himself using some rope or maybe his life vest to the hull, so he was anchored in place. And then he didn't get to sleep because the whole time he's thinking, this thing could sink under the water at any point and it will drag me with it because I'm tied to it, or he could just drift off of it if his rigging kind of came undone, if he was asleep. And so all night, beyond exhausted, he's just holding on to this hull, not really sure what's going to happen, but here he is, just waiting it out. And then finally, when the sun came up that next morning, as Nathan looked around him, he's in the middle of the ocean, he sees in the direction he had come from this pillar of smoke coming up over the horizon. And so Nathan, he rubs his eyes. He can't believe it. He's thinking, there's no way. There's already a ship out here. We're in the middle of nowhere. But sure enough, slowly but surely, this massive freighter ship came into view that was very far away. It's not near Nathan, but he can see it clear as day. And where the ship was basically circling was roughly where he believed his brother and the other two fishermen were still floating. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, the freighter is going to save them, and then it's going to come save me. And so Nathan just clung onto the hull and watched as this freighter made these big slow loops right around that same area. And then the freighter came to a full stop, and it appeared to lower something down into the water. It seemed very much like a full-blown rescue operation. And then about 3 hours after he first spotted this freighter, the freighter began to move again, and this time directly towards Nathan. Nathan was so relieved he could practically cry. But instead what he did is he thought, they're going to be here in a minute. I'm finally just going to close my eyes and go to sleep. And so he put his head down on the hull, looked one more time at the freighter, and then closed his eyes. Now, Nathan would be rescued, but it would not be by that huge freighter ship. Nathan eventually had opened his eyes after closing them for a second, and he saw this freighter that had been coming straight for him, at some point had kind of deviated and gone in the wrong direction and then vanished over the horizon, never to be seen again. And it would take 3 more days before a separate ship happened to find Nathan, they scooped him up, and they rescued him. But even though Nathan had been really crushed when that freighter had gone the wrong way, he held on to this idea that, that freighter had clearly rescued his brother and the other two fishermen. And certainly, even if they couldn't find him, they would go back and they would tell the authorities that Nathan is out there. He swam back to the hull of the ship. We got to go find him. And so certainly a rescue effort would be on the way. And it was true. A rescue boat had come out and found Nathan. So everything seemed to be tracking. And when Nathan woke up inside of his hospital room back on land, his friends and family were all by his bedside and he's looking around. He can't believe he survived. And the first thing he asks is, how's my brother? How are the other two fishermen? And why didn't that freighter pick me up too? And at this, all the people in the room just kind of looked at Nathan with a very confused look on their face. And eventually they asked him a question that made Nathan burst out in tears. They said, what freighter? It would turn out Billy Joe and the other two fishermen were still missing at this point, and nobody had heard a thing about some big freighter in the area. As far as anybody knew, at least in Nathan's family, that freighter ship did not exist. The search for Billy Joe and the remaining two crew members went on for weeks and weeks, and while the active search out on the ocean was going on, the Coast Guard and police were searching through every record they could possibly find of basically any ship that was even roughly in the area where Nathan and the others had been. But despite looking everywhere, there was basically no sign that any ship of any kind had been there beyond the rescue operation that eventually scooped up Nathan. And so again, it seemed very likely that that freighter ship didn't exist. And, it was possible that Nathan, in his very deteriorated state, had maybe hallucinated it. Although Nathan was adamant, he definitely saw that ship. It did not feel like, a multi-hour long hallucination. It felt like he was watching a ship. He was sure of it. But again, there was just no proof, and so nobody knew what to think of that. And then eventually, even though there was this huge search going on, there was just no sign of Billy Joe or the others, and so eventually the search was called off, and unfortunately, the presumption was Billy Joe and the other two were now dead. 5 months later, on the afternoon of October 5th, 1990, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home. Now, by this point, the victims' families had all tried to sort of restart their lives following this tragedy, but deep down, none of them could truly accept that Billy Joe and the other two fishermen were just gone. They just couldn't do it. It was too soon. It felt like, any moment they were going to get news that, they had been rescued by some freighter ship or something. And so anytime a phone rang in any of these families' homes, it's like they would rush to the phone with the sense of hope that this time it's going to be different. Their loved ones are going to be okay, only to obviously be crushed when that was not the case. But on this day, on October 5th, that phone call that came through in Nathan's sister's home, that one was different. When Nathan's mother picked up this phone call in Nathan's sister's home, she answered it and said hello, and right away she thought, oh, this has to be a wrong number, because the person who was calling was speaking in rapid Spanish, and she didn't understand what they were saying. But as she was about to hang up, the caller, intermittently throughout their rapid Spanish, began saying something in English that Nathan's mother could understand, and it totally shocked her. The caller kept saying Nathan's sister's name over and over again, followed by Nathan's sister's phone number, like on repeat, the name, the phone number in English over and over and over again. And Nathan's mom is so caught off guard by this that she just listened, not even sure what to do. And then before she could ask any follow-up questions, the caller cut the line and the phone call was over. And then a few minutes later, another phone rang in a home that was not far away from Nathan's sister's home. And this other home belonged to the boat owner who Billy Joe had rented the fishing boat from that unfortunately sank and caused this whole tragedy. And so this boat owner, he picks up the phone, he answers it, and just like the call that had come through in Nathan's sister's house, this call was the same. It was somebody calling, speaking rapid Spanish, and the boat owner was about to hang up when he heard something that he understood because it was in English. And what he heard was his own name followed by his phone number over and over and over again. Basically the same type of call that Nathan's mom had just heard. And then before the boat owner could ask any questions, the line went dead. Now, one phone call like this, you could chalk up to maybe a prank or a wrong number or just a really weird coincidence. But to have those two calls happen within minutes of each other and basically take on the exact same form, but different names and different phone numbers, it just seemed way too coincidental to not be somehow connected to the missing fisherman. Because the link between these two households where these calls came in was the doomed fishing trip. And these calls did not stop. Every few weeks after this first time these calls came through, The phone would ring in Nathan's sister's house or in the boat owner's house, and it would be the same thing all over again. Rapid Spanish followed by either Nathan's sister's name and then her phone number, or the boat owner's name and his phone number, just like that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so as soon as this started happening, Nathan's family and the boat owner, they figured out they were both getting these weird calls, and they contacted authorities, which kind of restarted the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman, because now it seemed very plausible that maybe Nathan really had seen a freighter, and that freighter really had picked up Billy Joe and the others, and maybe they had been taken to another country, a Spanish-speaking country, and maybe people were trying to get in touch with the families now to get them back home. Or, of course, there could be a negative side to this, that maybe they were captured by some rogue vessel and were being held by these people who were calling. I mean, there's any number of theories, but it made authorities wonder, hey, what's going on here? And so authorities got in touch with Mexican authorities and other Spanish-speaking country authorities and tried to figure out if there was any chance that there was, a vessel out there around the time that Billy Joe and the others were missing that in theory could have maybe illegally been in that area or something. But despite this kind of exhaustive effort to kind of look again to see if maybe there was a freighter in that area, there was just no evidence that there was. It made no sense, but the authorities said, look, we have no idea what these calls are about. We still do not think that freighter or any ship that even resembled a freighter was out there. We still believe that Billy Joe and the others are dead. But as for the victims' families, they just didn't buy that. They really believed that these strange phone calls were somehow connected to Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. Specifically, these calls must signal that Billy Joe and the others were still alive. They just had no evidence to support that. That is, until March 6th, 1991, so almost a year after the doomed fishing vessel sank and Billy Joe and the others went missing. On that day, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home, and she answered it, and it was the voice who spoke in rapid Spanish, but this time they spoke in perfect English, and all they said was, "I'm bringing him home." And then the line went dead. And Nathan's sister screamed and she yelled for her husband to call police. They contacted the authorities. And again, it kind of brought back to life the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. And then after this call, there was a near constant presence of authorities on the Georgia coastline, basically looking out to the water, waiting, hoping for Billy Joe and the others to return. But unfortunately, they never did. And following that last phone call where the caller spoke in perfect English and said, "I'm bringing him home," after that, the call stopped. And so to this day, no one has ever been able to actually figure out what happened to Billy Joe and the other two fishermen. They are presumed dead at this point, but there's this one nagging question that surrounds the whole story, and that is, what did Nathan see? Was that actually a freighter picking up Billy Joe and the others? And if so, what did they do with them? Or was Nathan just hallucinating? It's entirely possible, but Nathan has always said he knows what he saw, and that was not a hallucination. As for the families of the victims, they still firmly believe that their loved ones are still out there, and someday they will come back home, and the families just hope they're alive long enough to be there for the reunion. On the afternoon of July 13th, 1994, a man woke up feeling very confused and disoriented, and he felt some pain in the back of his head. And as he opened his eyes, he kind of slowly realized that he was on his back in a ditch on the side of the road, looking up at a big blue sky. The man tried to sit up, but as soon as he did, he felt this throbbing pain in the back of his head, and he reached back to touch it, but the second he did, it hurt even worse, and he definitely felt there was a pretty big lump on the back of his head. And then when he brought his hands in front of his face, he saw he had all these bruises around his wrists that he had no idea what they were from. And so as this man in the ditch is trying to figure out what's going on, suddenly this older man who he didn't know just appeared by the side of the road and looked down and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And so the guy in the ditch is looking at this guy. He's got no idea who he is. And he wants to say, what's going on? Where am I? Who am I? What's happening? But he couldn't find the words. It's like he just kept looking at this older guy, looking at his wrists and feeling his head and having no idea what's going on. But then for some reason, 3 names popped into this guy's head, the guy in the ditch. He thought of 3 names. He had no idea whose names these were, but for some reason, he felt like those names were really important. And so after a few minutes of awkward silence, as the guy in the ditch is trying to talk, he finally just blurts out these 3 names. He says, Pat, Joel, Chris. And so the older man who had asked the guy in the ditch what was going on, he didn't really know how to react to this guy blurting out these names. And so he kind of ignored it and just said, "Okay, hi, my name's Steve." And then Steve, the older man, helped the guy from the ditch out of the ditch. And then once the man in the ditch was on his feet, kind of looking around, he looked at Steve and suddenly he could say other words. And he said to Steve, "Where are we?" And Steve looked at him and said, "We're in Cheyenne, Wyoming." Now, the guy in the ditch didn't know why, but he immediately felt like Wyoming had to be wrong. Like, there's no way he could be in Wyoming. But the guy in the ditch didn't know where he was supposed to be. He didn't know who Steve was. He didn't know who Pat, Joel, or Chris was. And so it's all totally confusing. And so he just stood there kind of saying nothing. And as he did, Steve said, "Hold on a minute, I'm going to get my stuff." And so Steve kind of shuffled down the road like 10, 20 feet away, where there was a shopping cart full of cans, and there was a backpack and some other things dangling off the side. And as Steve grabbed the shopping cart, turned it around, and slowly began pushing it back towards the guy in the ditch stared at Steve and kind of put together that, Steve must be homeless. And this realization made the guy in the ditch think that, maybe he was homeless too. And so suddenly, instinctively, the guy from the ditch began reaching into his pockets, thinking maybe he had an ID or something that would show him who he was, that would show he was not homeless, that he had a place that he needed to go to. And he reached in his pockets, but there was nothing. All he found was 23 cents and a comb. And so by the time Steve came over with his cart and asked the guy from the ditch, "Hey, do you want to come to the shelter with me?" the guy from the ditch was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll go with you." And then once the guy from the ditch and Steve arrived at the shelter, when they went inside, the guy from the ditch had to introduce himself to the people who ran the shelter. And so he made up a name combining one of those names that was running through his head, Pat, with the color of the desk of the person who was asking him for his name inside of the shelter. And so he just called himself Pat Brown. And after Pat Brown got a room inside of the shelter, he went to bed that night, still having no idea what was going on, but he felt confident, if I just sleep tonight, I'll wake up tomorrow and I'll know what's going on. I'll figure out, what happened to me. But the next day when Pat woke up, he was still completely confused, did not know who he was, had no idea what was going on, but he had the wherewithal to know that, something bad must have happened to him, and maybe he should go talk to the police, because maybe they would know if other people were looking for him or something. And so Pat walked from the shelter to the police station. It was not far away. And he went inside and very politely, he walked up to the desk. He introduced himself to the cop who was on duty. And Pat just began explaining to the cop as much as he could remember. He said, yesterday I woke up in a ditch. I don't know who I am. I don't know why I'm here. I think I have amnesia. I just keep thinking of 3 names in my head, Pat, Joel, and Chris, but I have no idea what they mean. Can you help me? Now, the cop who's hearing this did not think, "Oh my goodness, this is totally legitimate. Let's launch an investigation to figure out who you are." Instead, the cop is like, "Is this guy on drugs? Is he mentally ill? What's going on with this guy?" But the cop would say, Pat was incredibly polite and did not appear to be intoxicated. And so the cop humored him and said, "Okay, you know what? Let's look through the most recent missing person reports in the area to see if somebody matching your description, is a missing person." And so the cop began going through the database, but he couldn't find anybody that matched Pat's description. And so at some point he said, "Look, I can't really help you very much here because you're a grown man. You do not seem to be in distress here. And even though it's very unfortunate that you can't remember who you are or where you need to go or, where your family is, that's not really a police matter." But as he was saying this to Pat, who's kind of crestfallen, he's putting his hands near his face and just kind of reacting to this news that the police are not going to help him. And the police officer says, "Hold on a minute, look at your hand." And so Pat looked at his hand and he saw, there was no ring on his left ring finger, but there was a pretty obvious callus where a ring should have been. It looked like, Pat must have been wearing a ring up until recently, and for some reason it was now off. And so the cop said, "Hey, it looks like you may be married or were married for a long time because you got that callus. But, beyond that, I'm sorry, there's not much else I can offer you." And so even though this was somewhat valuable information, it didn't really point Pat in any direction. And so he was about to turn and leave when the cop said, "Hey, do you want to ride to the hospital? Because it seems like you could be having some sort of medical event here." But Pat politely declined and just told the officer to please be in touch with him if anybody came calling looking for somebody that kind of seemed like him. And the police officer said he would. And so after this, Pat left the station and went back to the shelter and basically told himself, "I'm going to stay here and just wait until my memory comes back." Because at this point, that was kind of all he could do. However, weeks would go by at the shelter and nobody would contact the police looking for somebody like Pat Brown, and Pat wouldn't remember any more details. The only thing that kept coming into his head was those 3 names, Pat, Joel, and Chris, but that was it. And so finally, after a few weeks of no progress being made, Pat decided he would leave the shelter in Cheyenne and go to Jackson, Wyoming, because some other people in the shelter had talked about Jackson, Wyoming as being a place where people who don't have ID cards could get jobs and basically start over. And because Jackson was only a little over 400 miles away from Cheyenne, it was not unreasonable to try to hitchhike your way to Jackson. And so almost exactly 2 months from the day Pat woke up inside of this ditch, he began hitchhiking his way towards Jackson. And then when Pat got to Jackson, he was able to get a job without an ID. He got a job at a newspaper, sorting mail and doing some clerical work. And at first he stayed in a shelter like he had in Cheyenne until he had saved up enough money to rent a room. And as the months went by in Jackson, Pat did begin to remember additional details about what seemed like his former life. He discovered while doing clerical work at the newspaper that he was able to use an adding machine without looking at it. It was like his fingers just knew where to go. He also discovered that he was able to do really complex math problems in his head. And then also, in virtue of being at the newspaper, he saw a lot of information about the stock market, and he actually seemed to know a lot about the stock market, even though he didn't know why. Also, while Pat was in Jackson, he started to feel this really intense compulsion to go to a Catholic church. And so he began going to Catholic Mass, and while he was in church, he just automatically began saying the prayers along with everybody else, even though, again, he didn't really know why he had that information in his head. But the biggest clue that came back to Pat while he was in Jackson was this recurring dream he would have, where he was at this campground somewhere, and this little boy comes around the corner and looks up at Pat and says, "Hey, Dad, Mom needs your help with Chris." And then in the dream, he responds to this child by saying, "Okay, Joel, I'll be right there." And so with all these clues kind of coming back into focus, Pat sort of felt like he had a grip on who he used to be. Based on the callus on his finger and on that recurring dream, it did seem like he was a married man who had at least 2 kids, Joel and Chris, and so his wife was very likely named Pat, or maybe Pat was another child he didn't know. And then also he felt like he must have been maybe an accountant or somebody who worked with numbers, based on the adding machine and understanding the stock market and complex math problems. And also he was a devout Catholic, because that's the only way he would know all those prayers. But despite kind of putting together who he seemed to be in his previous life, that didn't really tell him anything about what he should do now. Like, he didn't know where his potential family was, or where his job was, or where he should go. And so even though he had this kind of former life formed in his mind, he couldn't act on it. And so Pat's weird life in limbo in Jackson, Wyoming, just kind of continued to drag on. And so by the end of 1997, so by this point, it's been 3.5 years since Pat has woken up in the ditch confused. He's still in Jackson, Wyoming. He still has no idea who he is. And it's starting to set in that unless he takes drastic measures here, he'll never figure out the truth about who he is. And so early in 1998, Pat does take drastic measure. He contacts a very popular TV show at the time called Unsolved Mysteries and asks them to please cover his story, because if they did, it would be broadcast across the country and maybe somebody out there would recognize him and come find him. And sure enough, when Pat contacted Unsolved Mysteries, they thought his story was totally insane and they covered it. Pat's episode aired on April 10th, 1998, almost exactly 4 years after Pat woke up in that ditch. And on the day his episode aired, in a city in Indiana, 1,500 miles away from Jackson, Wyoming, a phone rang in a woman's house. And so she answered it, and it was her cousin, and her cousin told her, "Stop whatever you're doing and turn on the TV. Put it on channel CBS." And so this woman, she walks into the living room, she turns on the TV, flips it to CBS, and she sees an episode of Unsolved Mysteries is playing, and it's Pat Brown's episode. And this woman is staring at the TV, and she practically faints when she sees what it's about. But she stays composed and just stands there staring at the TV, so shocked she can't even say anything. And the whole time her cousin is yelling through the phone, saying, "Can you believe it? Oh my goodness." And then at some point on the TV, a phone number flashed at the bottom of the screen where the producers of the show told the audience, "Hey, if you know anything about this case, call this number." And so at this, the woman who's watching the TV, she hangs up on her cousin and she dials that number she sees on the TV. Pat's drastic decision to call Unsolved Mysteries would indeed solve the mystery of who he was. However, the truth about who Pat was is not what you think. It would turn out some of the clues that Pat had sort of naturally recalled in those 4 years that he was kind of figuring out who he was were indeed clues of his former life. He really was a married father. Those three names, Pat, Joel, and Chris, those were the names of his wife and his two sons. Pat was his wife, and Joel and Chris were his two sons. And he really was a devout Catholic, which is why he was able to remember all of those prayers. But some of the other clues he thought of over those 4 years, like his incredible aptitude for math, or the fact that he could use an adding machine without looking, or the fact that he understood the stock market so easily, those were clues about his former life, but specifically, they were clues about why Pat was in this position in the first place. It would turn out Pat Brown was actually a man named Carl Brodnick Jr. And Carl Brodnick Jr. was a wanted felon who had misappropriated tens of thousands of dollars from the advertising agency where he worked as an accountant. And Carl had been under serious criminal investigation when he suddenly disappeared from his home in Indiana on July 8th, 1994, which is 5 days before Pat Brown woke up in that ditch on the side of the road with a lump on his head, markings on his wrist, and having no idea who he was or what happened to him. Now, there has never been a perfect explanation for what actually happened to Carl, but if you think about this logically, his claim of having amnesia is very likely true. Why would a guy use amnesia as his cover story to flee the law, run to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and say, I don't know who I am, I don't know what happened to me, only to then, a few years later, go on national TV and out himself and totally make himself a target for the police? It doesn't make any sense. And then also adding credibility to this idea that maybe something happened to Carl versus Carl running off to save himself is we know that when Carl disappeared on July 8th, 1994 from his home in Indiana, he took out $1,000 in cash from his checking account and then also took out another large sum of cash from his home's second mortgage. However, when he woke up in that ditch, all the money was gone. He just had 23 cents in his pocket. Now, after Carl vanished from his house in Indiana, police did go looking for him because he was under criminal investigation, so they wanted to find him, and they pretty quickly found his car 250 miles away from his home in a strip mall parking lot in Missouri, but there was no sign of Carl anywhere. And then right after the police found his car, they checked Carl's credit card, and they discovered it had just been used in Colorado, so 900 miles away, to buy clothes. But when they went to that store and tried to find security footage of, when that transaction took place, there was no footage. And so there was no way of knowing if Carl really was the guy in Colorado making that transaction or if somebody else had his credit card. And then after that, there were no other leads. Nobody had any idea what happened to Carl. His family didn't know, the police had nothing to go on. And so very quickly, his case went cold until 4 years later when that episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired. Now, there are many theories about what could have happened to Carl, but the leading theory, that again is just a theory, is that Carl may have been in debt to some very dangerous people. And so when he fled his home in Indiana, it's very likely that he was not running from the law, even though he was under criminal investigation. He was actually running from these dangerous people. And that the reason he might have been stealing from his company was to pay off these dangerous people, but apparently it wasn't enough. Hence why he decided to just kind of take off and run away. And these dangerous people seemed to have caught up to him, and they captured him, and it looked like they tied his wrists at some point because of the marks on his wrist, and they very likely tortured him or something, hence why he had this very serious head injury. And then it seems like they dumped him on the side of the road, very likely to die. They might have thought he was dead already, but he didn't die. And when he came to, he must have really had amnesia from the injuries he sustained from these bad people that chased him down. But again, that's just a theory. When Carl's episode of Unsolved Mysteries aired, it was his wife, Pat Brodnick, who was the one who saw him on TV and couldn't believe it and called it in. And then when she called this in, at first, Carl was reunited with his family, and it was this big happy reunion. Carl comes back home, he sees his wife and his kids, and then he's immediately arrested and prosecuted for embezzlement. Now, ultimately, Carl would plead guilty to the charges against him, but he would say the whole time, I don't remember committing this crime. I don't remember anything. And so ultimately, Carl did not get sent to prison. He instead served time on probation, and then after it was over, he just went back to living as Carl Brodnick Jr., despite still having huge gaps in his memory, at least according to Carl. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you've come to the right place.